Hi everyone, it is April from Getting Hooga With It. Today I am going to recommend books to you based on your requests. So let's get into it. So this is going to be part one of two because I had so many requests. I don't think I was even able to answer all of them, even in these two videos. So thank you guys so much for sending in your requests. We're going to dive right in to the questions, and I'm going to recommend you some books. The first question I got was from Taisha, and they asked something spooky and gothic with a creepy old house. So I've got two books that I would recommend to you. The first is a book that I've read and loved, and that is The 13th Tale by Diane Setterfield. This follows a young woman who has a bookshop with her family. She's also a biographer of very kind of obscure people who are not incredibly famous. However, she's approached by a woman who is an author, a very famous author, and this woman asks her to write her biography, and she agrees. However, this woman, this author, has hidden away a lot of her life. She's asked repeatedly about her childhood by various journalists, and she always comes up with a different lie for them. And so our main character doesn't know whether the author is lying or not. She goes to her house that's big and old and kind of creepy and or at least very full of secrets, and she interviews this author about her life, and I really enjoyed this, so I hope you will too. Another book that I have for you that I haven't read but I think sounds delightfully gothic in a creepy old house is In the Vines by Shannon Kirk. This follows a woman whose mother dies, and she goes to her aunt's estate, which is like a seaside estate in New England, and her aunt Liv is a bit of a strange character, and I think we meet her when she's hiding from her aunt Viv. But I mean, she grew up going to this seaside estate every summer. It sounds absolutely wonderful and also creepy with a creepy house. So I thought I would recommend that to you as well. Next, Morgan asked for a book that's back and forth between time with characters that I can completely fall in love with, similar to The Orphan Train or The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. I totally hear you on those two books and being completely swept away. I have two recommendations for you. The first is a book that I recently read. It's The House at Riverton by Kate Morton. This is Kate Morton's first book, and it follows a woman named Grace. She is in her 90s or her 80s, and a filmmaker comes to her and says, "We'd like to interview you for a film that we're creating about the place that you served as a lady's maid when you were young." And she agrees to go to the set and be interviewed, and all of a sudden all of these things come flooding back to her. When she was quite young, she went to be a lady's maid or a maid of some sort at this home, and she became kind of close in a way to the two girls of the home and of the family. And one night during a party, a poet is shot dead. It was ruled suicide, and you unravel what actually happened that night. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a really great debut. And I've read everything by Kate Morton now. So good. Another character that you will genuinely fall head over heels in love with is Addie Baum in The Boston Girl. I I think this is probably the book that like solidified my love for going backwards and forwards in time. In this book, we meet Addie as an older woman, and she's telling the story of her life to her granddaughter. She's telling the story of how she grew up and the friends that she had in Boston, and also falling in love. It's absolutely wonderful, and I really felt for Addie, and just I felt really tied to her, and I also like looked up to her a lot. So I'd recommend The Boston Girl. Okay, so Lauren asked for contemporary prodigal son or daughter returns that's a mystery. Now, I couldn't do the whole prodigal part because that's very specific, and nothing on my shelves really hit on that, so I'm sorry for that. But I do have several books where a person goes home after many years of being away on purpose. I haven't read either of them, so fingers crossed they're good. The first is Your Life is Mine by Nathan Ripley. This is, I believe, a Canadian author. And this follows Blanche. She is a filmmaker. I think it's early on in her career. She has very much had a difficult childhood. She has distanced herself entirely from her father because her father was a cult leader and a killer, and his name was Chuck. And when she was just a child, he went on a shooting rampage and killed many people, including himself. Now, she goes back home reluctantly because she finds that her mother has been murdered, and she believes that someone in that cult that her father was the head of is responsible for it, and she gets involved with the police and everything. It sounds really good. And then I have more of a horror book for you. It's called Violet by Scott Thomas. Scott Thomas also wrote Kill Creek, which I also haven't read, but I really want to read. This follows Chris Barlow. When she was a child in the summer of 1988, she went to this home with her mother who was dying. It was really their last summer together, and she was essentially saying goodbye. Now we follow her 30 years later. I think she has a daughter of her own, and she goes back to that home. And I think there's someone there, and I think it's a ghost, and I think that ghost also affected her in her childhood. So this is more of a horror story, but it's still got that the daughter returns home aspect to it. So it might be of interest to you. Next, Michelle asked for a good horror novel, one that's seriously scary, one to remind me why I fell in love with reading. So I have two books for you here. The first is my favorite horror novel of all time. It's a new one, and it is the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires. This is, yes, terrifying. I was terrified. It is also deep. It is also funny. So it's got all of these things in horror. I feel like this is the best of horror. In this book, we're following a woman named Patricia in the 90s. She belongs to a book club. It's a true crime book club. And one night after leaving a book club, she's attacked by a neighbor, an elderly neighbor. And she essentially becomes embroiled and becomes tied to a man in the neighborhood who might be a vampire. And there were scenes in here that I was literally holding my breath while reading because I was so terrified. But Grady always balanced those terrifying moments with a lot of humor, so you weren't overwhelmingly scared all the time. I loved it so much. Again, it's my favorite horror novel of all time now. And then I've got a classic horror novel here that I haven't read, but I really want to read, and I've heard it's quite creepy and terrifying. And that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. So this is a classic, and sometimes you need to go back to the classics to be reminded of why horror is just such an amazing, amazing genre. And many, many books are based on this book, like Paul Tremblay's Feeding the Ghosts is inspired by We Have Always Lived in the Castle. So in this book, we follow sisters who live in a village, but very much removed, because one of the sisters has been rumored to having poisoned much of her family and got away with it. And so the whole town is slightly terrified of her. And it's about her life with her sister in this castle. I'm assuming it is an actual castle. So there is that for you as well. Next, Stephanie Poff, who is one of my dear friends in real life, she said that she really wants a read that is soul-searching, spiritual, self-help type guidance book. And I've got 2 books here for you that I have read myself and I really loved them. One is a little more serious than the other. The first book that I want to share with you is The Gifts of Imperfection. Let go of who you think you're supposed to be and embrace who you are. So Brené Brown is really well known for her vulnerability research. And she talks about the importance of vulnerability and the importance of sharing yourself with people who you trust, that earn it. So she interviewed a lot of people about wholehearted living. And the people who had even gone through the worst things in life were rooted in very specific things. And she found this repeatedly again and again. So she has a list of like goalposts, basically, or guideposts, I should say. So things like cultivating authenticity, cultivating a resilient spirit, cultivating creativity, and all of these things that they had cultivated to make themselves very wholehearted people. And you can implement it into your own life. I loved this book. I need to reread this book. I will never get rid of this book on my shelves because I love it that much. So I would recommend The Gifts of Imperfection. And I would also recommend, maybe you should talk to someone by Lori Gottlieb. So Lori Gottlieb is an actual therapist. In this book, she is dealing with a breakup. She was head over heels in love with a man who had met her son, and who basically at one point was like, I don't really want to have a son, so bye. And she's completely shocked, and she decides that she's going to go to therapy. And so she goes to therapy, and you see her working through the issues and all of the problems that she's dealing with this breakup, and it goes much deeper as well. And then you also meet her own patients that she has. She's changed the names and everything, but you get to know them and you get to see their layers as well, and her helping them. And I want to reread this and go through with a highlighter for this one as well, because I learned a lot and loved it. It's also quite funny at times, and just goes to show how real therapists are. I feel like a lot of the time we all have these notions that therapists like know what they're doing at all times and like have their stuff together at all moments. But this kind of shows that they're really people who have many, many tools to guide them through life. I talked a lot, but I wanted to recommend those books to you, Steph. Oh boy. Okay, so Jennifer wrote a long message. She said, all the atmospheric Gothic suspense you can dish out. I'm reading Rebecca for the first time ever, and I'm loving it so much. I'm kicking myself for putting it off for so long. I also love My Cousin Rachel, and I adored Tangerine and The Lost Orphan after your recommendations. I'm really, really glad you liked them. Oh, some things I want more of. Gothic mystery, Descent into Madness, Single White Female-esque, or The Black Widow, Out for Revenge, creeping feelings of being trapped, possession, panic, passion. A hint of paranormal is always fun. So first things first. So many things on that list are in probably the quintessential Gothic story. Have you read Jane Eyre yet? If you have not read Jane Eyre, like finish Rebecca and then go and read this right away after, because this is very Gothic. And I don't want to ruin anything, but many of the things on your list there are in Jane Eyre. But you also get the story of Jane, who is a quiet character, but very self-confident. She relies on herself because she's kind of been forced to her whole life. She's raised by her aunt and her cousins, and kind of shipped off to boarding school. And you follow her through her whole life, from childhood into becoming a woman. And it's about her story and the many people she meets, including a governess job where a lot of the Gothic creepy things occur. Enjoy. Maybe you've already read it. I hope you have. Next is The Silent Companions by Laura Purcell. This definitely has that trapped vibe, I would say. It's definitely Gothic. It's very dark, very atmospheric, about a woman who is pregnant. She is newly married, but she's also newly widowed because her husband dies. And she moves to the home that she was supposed to live with her husband in. And it turns out to be very eerie. There are all of these essentially life-size dolls. They're about the size of an actual child. And she finds them looking at her, and she finds them like moving around through the house. But she's in this secluded area and she's heavily pregnant, and you know, mystery ensues. So there's that. Okay, one last request and then I'm gonna do part 2. Next is Caitlin Loves Books. She said, I want World War II stories about life on the home front. So I have 2 suggestions for you. One I've read, one I haven't read. The first is The Last Year of the War by Susan Meissner. I haven't read this, but I really want to. This is her latest book. It is World War II, and we follow 2 children named Elise and Maruko. They live in the US, but they are both sent to internment camps. One of them is sent there because her father has Nazi sympathies. The other is sent there because she's Japanese, and they're sent to an internment camp. And it's about their relationship together and their experience. And I don't feel like, well, there is more awareness about this event that happened in the States, I think in Canada as well, but it is definitely an at-home story, but it's just not going to be rah-rah US, I guess, because you're following 2 children in an internment camp in the US. So there's that. And then a book that I absolutely adored was Dear Mrs. Bird by A.J. Pierce. This follows a woman named Emmeline Lake, and she is a journalist. She's so excited that she's gotten a job to work at a newspaper, and she gets there on the first day and she's like, right, I'm going to be at the front lines reporting the war. But instead she's actually assigned to a woman's column called Dear Mrs. Bird, and there is actually a Mrs. Bird in the office. However, Mrs. Bird is a bit of an uppity woman who doesn't respond to many letters from women who need help in one way or another. She's very judgmental, and Emmeline thinks she's too judgmental, and Emmeline thinks that the readers of Dear Mrs. Bird deserve better, and so she starts writing back to these women who need help. She starts writing back as Mrs. Bird, definitely, you know, breaking the rules. And when I picked this up, I thought it was going to be very, very light. And it starts out very, very light, and then it moves into something much darker. Emmeline also is on like a team of people who during the night will go out in London and essentially look for people after bombings and stuff. So you see a lot of the war and the difficulties of the war through her eyes. And I just loved it so much. So I hope that you will read that as well. I'm going to end this here because it's getting long. And I'm going to do a part 2 because I had so many requests from you all. I hope that you guys have enjoyed this. And hopefully after the part 2, maybe I'll do this again in a few months from now. In the comments below, let me know, and let the people who wrote in know if you have any suggestions for them. I'm sure they would love to hear your suggestions. I hope you're doing well, and I'll talk with you soon. Bye.